Welcome back to Birds of a Feather Talk Together. John, Shannon, Amanda, and I discuss the ruby-throated hummingbird this week. We have a ton of fun with this one and also answer a mailbag question on feather iridescence and possible genetic mutation when someone saw a mallard duck with a purple head. It's a super fun episode. I feel like we were laughing the whole time. We're all having fun today, so enjoy. Okay, go grab your binoculars and let's get into it. Welcome back to Birds of a Feather Talk Together. This is RJ, and I'm with John, Shannon, and Amanda, and today we're talking about the Ruby-throated Hummingbird, so we're really excited for that. John and Shannon have been pushing to do one for a while, and I think the Ruby-throated is one of the ones that Amanda and I at least are familiar with because they're in our area where we live, but we're excited to actually jump in and learn about them. So I think I feel like hummingbird, most people know what a hummingbird is, just kind of
not an insect.
Yeah. But I'm curious, overall hummingbirds, how would you describe what classifies a hummingbird, other than kind of the obvious? I mean, they're tiny little birds that their wings flap really fast and
Yeah, well, there are lots of morphological features that go into what it takes to be a hummingbird, including hovering, which is, do the basal ones hover too?
Yep.
So they all hover, and you need a special shoulder joint to do that. So if you looked at the skeleton of most birds, they don't show this. There's only one space that the hummingbird wing connects to the shoulder, and it's because they are able to rotate 180 degrees their wings, and that's how they generate the ability to hover, is by that. So if you attached a hummingbird wing the way other birds attach their wings, they wouldn't have the flexibility and ability to hover like that. So, I mean, I don't know what other things make. I mean, a hummingbird is one of those groups where when you see one, you know it.
Right.
Yeah. Except that there are old world versions that can definitely look like hummingbirds. So sunbirds are the old world equivalent of the new world hummingbirds. But nobody's going to have trouble binning the hummingbirds into
they just have such amazing adaptations for what they do, and there's a ton of variation in the bills that are based on aspects of floral morphology that they use. Just like woodpeckers, they have to be able to, in order to successfully get at nectar, they have to be able to get their tongue beyond the tip of the bill, and so they've evolved what's the word I want? It's
almost like a straw, you mean, or a tube?
Well, there's that aspect of it. There's the structure,
frilled?
But I was going to say that, like woodpeckers, they've evolved the same kind of structure where the tongue is actually attached through connections that go over the skull out the nares.
Just like with woodpeckers, if you stick your tongue in somewhere to get food, and if you need to go far, your tongue is just sitting like a big hunk of whatever in your mouth. So you got to do something with it. So you put it out the back of your head and you lay it in your skull.
Which again is an independent evolution I think is just kind of amazing.
That is amazing.
And I always like to show people, again, there are 300 species of hummingbirds. One of them is sword-billed hummingbird, which has a bill that's probably 4 inches, 5 inches, 4.5 inches long or something. And that bird can put its tongue out past the tip of its bill.
Oh my gosh.
Wait a minute.
That's amazing.
So they're awesome. And ruby-throated in the grand scheme of things is just a run-of-the-mill hummingbird. It's
not if you live in the eastern U.S.
Right,
it's your only hummingbird.
Only regular one.
Yeah.
Every once in a while, there's a weird one that shows up.
Fair.
But it's just growing up in Arizona, I was in a place where you go to the mountains, you get a couple of different species. There are ones that show up on the border coming over from Mexico, and there are ones that are just always breeding down in the deserts. And in the eastern U.S., there's only ruby-throated in the breeding season, and it's only here in the summer. And yet at the same time, it's such a great bird because they're really fun to have come back. And, like so many birds, they've adapted to when people put out feeders they'll come to them and pick up nectar. And, again, it's just that they're spectacular little birds.
The thing that always amazes me about that bird, it weighs the amount of a penny, right? An old penny before they couldn't afford to put too much copper in. But so it weighs that, and that thing goes across the Gulf of Mexico.
That's crazy.
Across. That's a long ways for a little tiny bird. So there's a lot to admire about hummingbirds.
Incredible.
And they do that nonstop because obviously there's no way for them. I guess probably some of them land on some of the.
Some of them go along
along
the Gulf, where they'll hit the Gulf of Mexico.
And I
then
think they
move
land
around.
on the oil rigs in the Gulf sometimes
Oh,
too.
wow.
I saw something about that, how some of them get tired going across the Gulf of Mexico and they'll look for oil rigs or big ships to take a break on. And I thought, how cool would it be to be sitting there on one of those oil rigs and you've looked at the same thing for weeks and then all of a sudden you have like a bunch of hummingbirds that come take a break? That would be amazing.
Yeah, that's so sweet.
So we're so used to seeing them, around feeders or around, flowers like near houses and everything. And last summer we were hiking up in Wisconsin and we're just deep in the woods on a trail and saw one and to see him out in the woods was pretty incredible. Just, I don't know, the way they move and everything, it's totally different than seeing it in your backyard or I mean, it was pretty fun to see. It was so identifiable. We're like, oh my gosh, there it is. And it just kind of sped off.
Right.
And the ability to just start and stop and fly really fast and then, I don't know, stop on a dime was really, really cool to see.
Oh, they're just incredible. And then, here's this tiny little bird. Well, they've got to raise young, so their nests are really cool and fun to watch. And their clutch size is no hummingbirds lay anything other than 2 eggs.
Oh, and they're white. And
they look like chicklets.
Yeah.
Oh. And their nests are pretty unique, it sounds like, too, that they don't build them in a V of a tree. They put it out in the middle of a branch and build a nest that just sits upright.
And they use spider webs to attach it, to affix it to the branch that they use. Often their nests are lined with spider webs as well. That material is a good structure for these birds.
And I think that's an interesting thing. I don't necessarily know why they choose to do that, because they're often not particularly hidden. I wonder if at some level they're just hoping to be too small to be noticed.
Oh, well, they're hard to get to see up close. And looking at pictures of them online, you really see how vibrant their ruby throat is. And we were looking at just how incredible their feathers look. It almost looks like plated armor or something. When you look at the way that their bill sticks out and then all the feathers underneath, it was pretty cool.
And that's called a gorget. That covering of a neck is called a gorget, and that gets back to kind of battle wear almost. And it was a neck thing that protects the neck, usually made of steel. So those things were historically called gorgets too. So you can see where the reference comes from. And now even humans that might put fabric on their necks or something, those are called gorgets too, but that's not where the word came from. It's not just only associated with bird feathers or, cloth,
But I love how those iridescent throat feathers sometimes, depending on which direction the bird is facing, and it's not catching the light at the right angle, it can look almost black.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's, suddenly you're looking at this thing and it's black, and then it turns and you see the red. We had one of the first ones we've had at the feeder, I think last night. You said
you had it last week.
Well, I had one last week. So the one I had last week and this is another thing you can see sometimes with these birds, literally showed up the feeder, spent probably 5 to 10 seconds feeding, and then went north. Oh. And I'm sure that it was a bird that was literally on its way through. And again, we've been talking about some of these things like how birds adapt to built landscapes where there are humans. And I got the feeling that these birds have evolved the capacity to be able to spot feeders as they're moving along at these incredible rates that they fly, and it's just hey, I need to fill up. And
Do you think they will visit the same feeder on the way back, or I mean, will they take a similar route?
We've had this conversation before.
I had this incredible. Again, it was not an experience I had, but this story from my major advisor for my master's degree at University of Arizona. He and his wife started banding hummingbirds, and the crazy thing about banding hummingbirds is they're not normal bands. They literally, the Fish and Wildlife Service has figured out a way to make a sheet of a metal sheet with these tiny little numbers on, and then you have to cut them out with tin snips essentially, and hand bend them around the birds to get them, and they've done this, and they do get some returns. The one thing that the story that I always liked was in central Arizona, or south central Arizona, there's a place called Sonoyta, which is up in this grassland. And this guy said, I think I've got something like 5 to 10 hummingbirds showing up. And so Steve and Ruth, my major professor, and his wife went down there, and they brought some bands. They brought like 20 bands or so. And the way they catch them is you can put a little house around the feeder with a trap door. Oh. They'll come in to use the feeder, and then you drop the trap door. Oh. You can reach in and get the hummingbird and band it. And so they did this, and they actually used all 20 bands on birds in the first 20 minutes they were there, half an hour they were there.
Oh, so he thought it was only 4 or 5.
Right, exactly.
Oh, wow.
And they started, after that, they started putting black dots on the throats of these birds so they could tell if they'd at least handled them before, and they kept catching them, and they caught 80 birds.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my
and
gosh.
what it really shows you is in ruby-throat is like this too, is that during migration, there can be lots of individuals moving through an area, but because they're so small and you don't see them kind of in flocks like you would some of these other birds, you can have a really hard time estimating the actual numbers that are around. And I've always thought that was just incredible.
Yeah, that was true of chipmunks in our yard, too.
Where you think there are 2, there are 30?
There's 80.
More like there's 1. You think there's 1, there's 8 that you catch in the first hour to 2 hours that you have a trap out.
But then, like you were saying, you had that one in the forest. They spread across the landscape during the breeding season, and you would never know necessarily how many there are, and they're not very easy to census. Because the males have no role in the parental care. That's all done by the females. And so they can be, they'll find perches in the forest where you can see them over and over again. But a lot of times it's just, they're really hard to keep track of because they're just so small.
And they don't get along, right? They're not.
They're pretty pugnacious. There's a lot of defense of resources.
Okay.
And I've always wondered, I don't know of a lot of stories of like we were talking about house wrens in the last episode where individual hummingbirds injure other hummingbirds.
Okay.
It more is just sort of like chasing each other off in these incredibly...
No, they kill. They're not just sweetly telling someone to go away. They're very aggressive when it comes to that. But they have really interesting feathers because birds make a lot of sounds that don't come from their voice box in that sense. And so they have modified wings. The outer primaries are narrow and thin, and they make some of the buzzing noises that can change frequencies.
When you guys get out to Colorado, if you go up in the mountains, broad-tailed hummingbird is one of the classic examples of a mechanical sound.
Yeah, so there are a lot of birds whose feathers make sounds that you would absolutely not know were coming from feathers, that you would think were vocalizations, but they're not. They're vibrating feathers and all, the air going through feathers in different ways. So it's really pretty cool. And we should do club-winged manakin sometime. There's this bird of manakin, which is a New World tropical bird that is known for its display behavior. The whole family is. But this one species has these gnarled wing feathers that produce a perfect harmonic from them. So, And that was unknown for a really long time, exactly how that worked. And once there was high-speed photography and you could slow the video down, you could see it vibrating. And that's where the sounds come from. So technology really lets us do things that we couldn't do before, and who knows what technology's next.
Yeah.
All right.
So I'll give you an example of them being aggressive. Maybe where I don't think they actually hurt people. As a kid, I used to play wiffle ball in our backyard where there were black-chinned hummingbirds in Arizona. And black-chinned males do this display where they sit up high and then they do a loop where they come down to ground level. And I was always wondering whether anybody had ever walked in front of a hummingbird and actually had it hit them. And I don't know that that's ever happened.
Now, aren't there some weird National Enquirer stories about a hummingbird?
Well, they probably. Can you believe those?
Poked into someone's chest. And
Oh,
I
really?
don't think. Really?
There are stories like that.
It was Elvis. They poked into Elvis.
Yeah.
Elvis. Okay.
But you will see, Amanda, you were asking about, you will see male ruby throats chasing other hummingbirds, in defending their territories and things.
So the North American breeding bird surveys, which people should be aware are going to happen fairly soon, where on specific days people go into areas and count all the birds that they see, so we can understand the population dynamics of North American breeding birds. But they estimate that that there are 34 million ruby-throated hummingbirds.
What?
Oh
Oh my gosh.
Which, when I read that, I'm like, "What? You got to be kidding me!" But no,
it's a big geographic distribution.
It is. It has a very large geographic distribution, and the bird is small, so I guess you can pack a lot in a small space.
That's amazing.
I'd also say the error bars around that number are pretty substantial.
Okay.
Just saying.
And then there are lots of other fun facts about hummingbirds. There are lots of fun facts about hummingbirds. So ruby-throated hummingbirds' wings beat 53 beats a second.
Oh my gosh.
I mean, it doesn't even... So obviously that's how they hover, is with those kind of wing movements. And they also have really large breast muscles and very large keels to put that breast muscle attachments to. And you need that if you're going to hover like that. You have to have enough muscle. And I couldn't find it, but I remember reading kind of an account where people were trying to tell you how you would be if you were a hummingbird. And if you were a hummingbird, your keel would stick, your breastbone would stick 3 feet off your chest. 3 feet.
Oh my
That's
gosh.
what volume of muscle goes into. It's a third of their body weight.
I'll pull out a ruby-throated hummingbird skeleton, get a picture of it.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Cool.
It's because it's incredible how much of a role those breast muscles play for those birds.
Wow. So
and they have these tiny little feet.
They don't have knees. They don't walk.
Oh, really?
They can hitch themselves along branches or something.
No, they can't even.
Yeah, but they don't walk. Their legs are teeny tiny, tiny.
Wow.
Anyways, so I find that interesting. And then other fun facts, that their heart beats 1,260 beats a minute.
What?
And they take 250 breaths a minute.
What?
Oh my gosh.
How do you do
the physiology.
And that's
of
not a
those-
panic attack for them.
Right.
And from an evolutionary standpoint, you might think that there's only a limited number of ways you can do that, but there are 300 species of hummingbirds.
Wow.
And the other thing that's crazy to me about that is Europeans were so fascinated by them when they encountered them, when they got to South America and North America, that by 1850, 1860, 90% of the species had actually been described, which is just amazing. There's this artist, John Gould, who worked with Darwin, who did this monograph on hummingbirds, and it's just, every time I look at it, I'm just blown away that people knew so much about them.
Wow.
And then that turned into this kind of horrible period where they were bringing them in for the millinery trade and putting them in women's hats. And again, I think the incredible thing is that there aren't very many hummingbirds that are considered to be super rare or super endangered, which is kind of amazing.
Yeah.
And I always worry a little bit that they could go under the radar because they are so hard to census. But at the same time, I think even though it's this incredible specialized morphology and physiology, it's led to a whole bunch of speciation.
That's why they've been able to do that.
Yeah.
So
Are they only in the Americas then, or are they just not in Europe?
Well,
So
they
that's
are
a
now.
really interesting question because there are Eocene fossils from Europe that have been attributed to hummingbirds.
So to me, that's the most surprising thing I've learned in ornithology.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Because you don't.
That's crazy.
I mean, someday people will think that about passenger pigeons or Carolina parakeets, right? There's a Carolina parakeet in the U.S. True. And the fossils tell us some things like that. But I think that's just mind-blowing.
Yeah.
That also, the closest living relatives of hummingbirds are swifts, which is not intuitive. And they're nested within the tree of life for caprimulgiform birds, so nightjars, things like that.
Crazy.
So, yeah. And so there's a lot of interesting transitions from nocturnal to diurnal lifetime, whether you fly around at night or feed during the day, that can be answered. Really interesting things about vision, given that so many of their relatives are active at night, and that has certain consequences for their visual pigments and their eye structures. So those transitions are really important to study to understand how eyes work and what are the consequences of being of living your life a lot at night. So,
and with 300 species, another thing that's kind of amazing is, again, you think of hummingbirds as being small, and actually the smallest hummingbird, which is a Cuban bee hummingbird, is probably half the size of a ruby-throated hummingbird.
Really?
So it's even smaller than a ruby throat. And the largest one is giant hummingbird from the Andes of South America, and they're probably about the body size is probably about 6 to 7 inches long.
Really?
And so you start realizing, again, there's all kinds of variation across hummingbirds. It's just reduced down to this starting point of a small-sized bird.
and all different shapes, sizes, and colors of them, shapes of beaks, flowers that they pollinate. So they're really important aspects of their biologies. They drink nectar, but they also eat insects, but they pollinate flowers.
So they play a role similar to bees in pollinating and
And you get some aspects of so Charles Darwin's famous for saying that he saw these flowers when he got to the Andes that had these very long corollas, and he hypothesized that there had to be a bird or a moth that could pollinate them. And it turns out there's both. There's actually a moth with a tongue that can pollinate flowers like this, and then there's sword-billed hummingbird, which has this 6-inch or 5-inch long bill.
They also have really interesting decorative feathers, not just the iridescent part, which spans all colors and ways you can make iridescent, but they have bizarre tail feathers, and they're amazing. And think about that bee hummingbird on Cuba is half the size of that ruby-throated hummingbird that you see.
Oh my gosh.
And it is mistaken for a bee often. It is tiny.
That's crazy.
So that's the smallest bird.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I always find myself with ruby-throated hummingbird thinking that if I'm not conscious that they're around, that I could be overlooking them because something would go by, and you see lots of insects that
Right.
are flying around, and
No, their flight is so distinctive. There's no way you would do that. You in particular would never do that.
I don't know.
Your eyes are so keen on anything that is a bird thing that goes by goes by your eyes. I don't believe that for you.
What am I missing out there? I'm always wondering.
Well, that's different. That's a different question. But I had some not so much fun meetings today, and I ended up staying at home for them. And I had the window cracked a little bit in the room where I have my Zoom meetings, and I could hear the hummingbird there all day. So
that's awesome.
John didn't see it, but I could hear it back and forth
I
all
couldn't
day.
hear it.
You can hear it now.
Sort of. Yeah.
So I kept focusing on hearing the hummingbird while I was trying not to get really super angry at other people.
Where we were in Colorado, there were a lot of hummingbird moths.
Yes.
And so we would always get excited and think it was a hummingbird, and it was just like, oh, it's just a hummingbird moth.
And those are
but
so
they're
cool.
cool.
Those are
too.
They're
They
really
are,
cool.
yeah.
They're not birds.
Exactly.
Yeah, they're not birds.
Yeah.
Those are really cool, though.
They're bird food.
Yeah. Yeah, probably.
Not hummingbird food, though. I don't think hummingbirds are taking down a moth like that.
How do you think the ruby-throated hummingbirds will fare against the cicadas?
Oh, that's an interesting thing.
Yeah.
They probably just ignore them.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure I'm going to fare so well against cicadas. Because if you've ever been in one of these eruptions, and this is like big, worse than the normal ones, and they are definitely loud. You can't even keep your windows open.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be able to hear anything when those things come out.
I'll give you a pair of the Field Museum earplugs I have. Our insect division
I'm
actually
deaf in
got a
one
bunch
ear,
made.
but
So you only need is one.
this deaf ear can still hear sounds like that. It's going to give me I'm going to have to take ibuprofen.
It is an interesting
cut
question.
The headaches.
We were talking about in one of the other episodes about people playing tapes. Well, what does ambient sound mean for breeding birds? Is it possible that the cicadas actually disrupt the
do they freak the birds out?
communication? I don't know. I could imagine there are some birds that do get freaked out.
There are going to be a lot of people getting freaked out by them.
Yeah, everybody's going to be
using
freaked
a
out.
snow shovel to get them out of their driveways.
I always think about it as a little package of protein.
Yeah.
And
cicadas aren't that little.
No, which is why I think that if you're a yellow-billed cuckoo, I'm looking for a big yellow-billed cuckoo year, just because I think they go around looking for outbreaks of caterpillars and things like that. So I don't see why cicadas would necessarily be all that different for them.
Are they nutritious though? Cicadas? They got a lot of.
Well, I think so. Somebody had said that they had read birds didn't like them, and what I'm thinking is some of that may be the adults have fairly hard shells and are actually kind of hard to break apart in a way that you can actually get at stuff.
Much easier, tastier, more protein.
If you put one of those things in a bomb calorimeter to measure the caloric content, I'm guessing there's quite a bit there. So you just have to work for it.
Yeah, to get in there,
Shannon, when you sent us that cicada cake thing, I thought it was a cake actually made of cicadas.
Oh, no.
I was like, I'm not opening that. And then Amanda showed me that.
We're at bakery in Highwood.
Yeah.
Did you go get one?
Not yet.
You have to order them. I have a feeling they're really popular. You need to order one. We need to have one. I'm not going to make
one. I have a feeling
one.
they're not really popular.
As much as I bake, I'm not making
a cicada cake.
A cicada cupcake or something like that. But I do need to have one.
All right. Well,
and that bakery's near you.
It is. Yeah, it's in Highwood. That's really close to us.
Yeah.
Yeah, we love Highwood.
Yeah.
So, we'll
people
go there
in
eventually.
Highwood need to sell RJ and Amanda their house.
Yes, that's where we're
Thank
looking.
you.
Yeah.
That's right, Shannon. Yes.
All right, so we have one mailbag question. Should we read that to close it out? So this is from Toby in Three Rivers, Michigan, and Toby says, I saw a group of mallard ducks, and one had a purple head, and the rest had green heads. I always thought they only had green heads. What was going on?
Go ahead.
Well, I think what's going on is that it's variation in the feathers of the backs of the crowns of mallards, such that I think it's always there. And sometimes when the light hits a mallard head, in certain ways you see green, and then in other ways you can actually pick up the purple.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
So you always have to be aware it could be a different species, but I don't think that's what's going on. Not a bunch of things with mallards like that. So yeah, the angle that the light hits these feathers can make them look completely different.
Okay.
And that's the that's the beauty of iridescence.
Yes.
That, these are structural colors. So the angle of the light makes a big difference, the way it hits and scatters light. Could there be mutations that really produced one that had more of the purple part? Maybe. There are a lot of mallards. There's a lot of reproduction, a lot of mutations that can happen, but I bet that's not what it is.
I mean, we've been talking about hummingbirds today, and we did a little paper with a whole bunch of the people that we work with because they had different expertise where it was a single individual hummingbird we collected in a area called Cordillera Azul, which is an outlying ridge of the Andes in the eastern side. And the gorget was kind of golden as opposed to being pink. And it turns out that the two species that are most likely in the area that are clearly related to this thing both have pink throats. And
so they thought they had a new species.
we were all excited because there are new species in these foothills. Doing this, we did the genetics, and the genetics suggested it was a hybrid between the two pink-throated parentals in the area.
Oh, okay.
And where I'm going with this is like one of the interesting things is how do you actually change the patterns of iridescence in these situations. And hummingbirds, coming back to this, just like ducks, are great examples where there's all this experimentation. But I think the example that's being asked about in the question is literally just sort of variation that results from the angles of the light. But then there are other situations where you're actually changing the color in the end completely. And
this bird, pink, these pink plus pink made orange.
Yellow. Okay. That's crazy.
So,
at least that's what we're saying in the paper. And
reviewers
but it might be a way in which
Yeah.
hummingbirds actually speciate. And you look across these different genera of hummingbirds, and you often see variations going from red gorgets to purple gorgets to blue gorgets. And so there's, how do you do that? Well, maybe hybridization is one of the ways that they actually create variation that again, the gorgets can occur in both sexes, but a lot of times they're just in the males. And so presumably it's females choosing males that have gorgets that are interesting. And if you showed up with a different colored gorget, that could be really good.
Okay. That's cool.
All right. Well, thanks, Toby.
Yes.
Yeah,
Good
thanks.
question.
Toby asking a question about
and
iridescence.
then we went to hummingbirds,
Yeah.
of course.
We had real quick when we were on our Florida trip, we saw terns that were had like a pink hue to their chest, and it was like in a group of like 30 of them, and there were
Yes.
two that were standing in front of them that had like a pink hue.
They were
And
markedly
it was,
pink.
Yeah, different than all the other ones. I took a picture. I'll send it to you. But
Yeah, you have
It
to
was-
send because there's
really-
a species
There
on
is,
the East
yes.
Coast called roseate tern.
Yeah.
oh,
And it's called roseate tern because it
Has
gets a little
pink
bit of
cast.
pink in
what?
the.
Oh,
and there's another
wait.
bird that does this, Ross's gull,
Oh.
which breeds up in the high Arctic, which
Oh.
gets this kind of pink cast to it.
Oh,
Oh,
Yeah.
so
Wait,
maybe
I'm
we
gonna
saw
send you the
something.
picture then,
Yeah.
No, I definitely want to see that.
yeah, yeah.
And I know the person to. Terns are notoriously different to identify, those small terns.
Oh,
They're
yeah.
But we know
Heinous.
Okay, okay.
people. Get that picture. That's cool.
I got a good picture of them. So
Yeah,
I'll
yeah.
send it to you. All right. Well, is there anything else hummingbird related we want to say?
Oh man, we've
Put your
got
feeders up.
299 episodes to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Talk about all the hummingbirds.
Now is a good time with your feeder to go listen to their sounds, because their sounds are extremely distinctive. Even for someone like me who has trouble remembering sounds, I don't have trouble remembering a ruby-throated hummingbird sound. and go outside and see if you can find them, and think that they don't have knees.
Yeah.
That little
is
bird.
crazy.
And, all the things that you read about hummingbird feeders, they're pretty easy to maintain. As long as you keep them clean, the birds will use them, and you can keep them out till the end of the summer, and that's fine too. You're not probably going to keep them from migrating. There's no evidence of that being the case. And so, they're just a lot of fun to have around.
That's
Yeah.
awesome.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. We appreciate the support. We do have one ask. If you don't mind leaving a review and rating in your podcast app, that would be greatly appreciated. We're trying to spread the word about our podcast, and rating us always helps. If you have a question for us, please reach out to podcast.birdsofafeather@gmail.com. All right, have a great week.